When Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator released, and I first saw Midnight Motorist, I was confused. I wasn't sure exactly what it was supposed to be. I think everyone just was very confused at this minigame for the longest time. And I had I kind of had my own interpretation after Ultimate Custom Night, you know, the Twitchy of the high school years cutscene kind of led me in a direction, but I was never really confident. Now, I feel like I have a good idea of what this minigame actually is. So let's start with what made me have a good idea of Midnight Motorist and what's going on in it. I think you know what I'm going to bring up. If you've been following the community and been following the Midnight Motorist for a little bit, I'm sure you know what the big revelation is that kind of sent me in a different direction. It's 5 Laps at Freddy's. The funny racing game, which for some reason has important lore in it, and this isn't even the only piece of integral lore in this game. Wild. In Five Nights at Freddy's, it confirmed 2 things, or at least heavily implied 2 things, because, you know, Five Nights at Freddy's is the canonicity of it's questionable, the lore reveals are questionable, but I think it's telling us a clear direction with 2 things it tells us about Midnight Motorist. First of all, there's Midnight Motor Car, which actually contains both of these things, and the first thing is a spring body antenna, which to me heavily implies it's about William Afton. People were already theorizing that the Mustard Man was William Afton before this game came out, so that extra big hit of clarification really feels like that was the correct answer, in contrast to my previous incorrect answer being about one of the missing children. Which, to be fair, that theory in retrospect really didn't make sense because it meant it was a Springlock suit in the rain. I don't know what I was thinking. As I said, I wasn't confident enough to make a video back then, for good reason. But now that I'm pretty sure that we are playing as William Afton, there's also a second piece of information for Five Nights at Freddy's with the dice, which says 87 on it, which are numbers you can't get on a 6-sided dice, so it feels very intentional. Now, it could just be a reference by our Click team who are making Five Nights at Freddy's, but I feel like I've thought this minigame through enough that I actually feel like that this does have meaning. You'll see what I mean. I'm not confident 1987 is the year this minigame takes place. I just think it's important to this minigame. Just to say that, because I think people were expecting me to say it's the year it takes place, and that's not quite what I think. At least I'm not confident in that. I'm just going to go through like every mystery that this minigame holds now. So mystery 1 of Midnight Motorist is, geez, that was a weird pronunciation, is who all the characters are. Obviously, the Mustard Man is now William Afton, and I feel like that heavily implies the rest of the people there are also the Afton family, at least once in the house. So originally I thought the couch person was Michael, and that the runaway was the crying child. But this has a very big flaw in it, which is that the runaway was lured out by an animatronic. This is a problem because the crying child dies so early in the timeline that there are no haunted animatronics yet to be able to do that. I mean, sure, the puppet in my opinion, I think the puppet could have died before the crying child. I'm not confident in that statement, but I feel like Charlotte could have died and haunted the puppet before then, but those footprints are definitely not the puppets, so irrelevant to this minigame anyways. I don't think anyone else died before the crying child. At least no one in those original games. I'm sure Secret of the Mimic will toss out a bunch of new characters, but no one relevant to the original story. Which makes me kind of switch the roles a little bit. I think now, the runaway is Michael, and that the couch person is the wife, Mrs. Afton. Just a side note, when do we get Mrs. Afton relevance? Please? She's like, never shows up. Can she do something at some point, please? That would be great. Now, I know, like, the immediate thing that caught me off guard was like, oh, but the couch person has so many similarities with Michael. Speaks in grey text, watches TV, part of the Afton family. That really feels like it's pointing towards Michael, and that is why I thought the crying child was a runaway originally. But then I realized in the survival logbook, it actually tells us that Michael has similarities with his mother. At least it implies it, because it says that Michael relates to Clara from The Immortal and the Restless, and The Immortal and the Restless I think is widely assumed to be a parallel to the Afton family, with Vlad being William, Clara being his wife, and the baby that's obviously Vlad's son is Michael. So if Michael relates to Clara, and Clara is a parallel to his mother, then that seems to imply that his mother is similar to him. So that could explain why Mrs. Afton has so many similarities to Michael in that minigame. At least it's a good enough explanation for me to roll with it, because then that would allow Michael to be the runaway, and then that would allow Golden Freddy to be the animatronic that lures him out, because Golden Freddy is haunted by the crying child. It was a heavily assumed theory that the crying child haunted Golden Freddy before, but the week before, like, really hammered it down. So I'm pretty confident in that statement now. And if the crying child haunts Golden Freddy, then I'm sure that the animatronic that lured Michael somewhere was his brother, the crying child in Golden Freddy. That also leads to the question of where to. Some people say he lures Michael to the mound. I don't think so, because there's no footprints there. Like, the minigame goes out of its way to show that there's footprints the runaway left, but it doesn't put those footprints near the mound, which tells me that the runaway did not run to the mound, they were lured to somewhere else. And if it's Golden Freddy luring Michael, I'm assuming that was luring Michael to Freddy's. That's the part of this that I'm most confident in. This is about William going home, and Michael's left because the crying child lured into Freddy's, and we get a slight amount of characterization for his wife. But there's more to this minigame, there's a lot more. So first off, I want to talk about the part where William Afton says that he'll be sorry when he gets back. No matter who the runaway is, I really do feel like this is implying William puts whoever the runaway is into the Fights Freddy's 4 observatory rooms. If you don't remember, from Sister Location, it's confirmed that the rooms in Fights Freddy's 4 are these experiment rooms as part of Circus Baby's underground bunker thing. And it's called the Observatory 1, Observatory 2, and I assume the third one's Observatory 3, but it's not technically named. I assume that this is the reason why William puts Michael in Observatory 2. Now, I wasn't confident Michael ever went through that. It was my interpretation that Fights Freddy's 4 was the crying child in Fights Freddy's 1 giving Mike nightmares, and that the nightmares in Fights Freddy's 4 is a combination of the crying child's trauma and Fights Freddy's 1 just combined together. That was my previous interpretation. However, if Mike was put in the observatory rooms, that's a bit skewed. I think it's a bit different now. I gotta think more on the Fights Freddy's 4 implications later. I haven't exactly thought that through entirely. But either way, even if it does or doesn't affect Fights Freddy's 4, I do think this is implying that this is the moment where Mike was put into these rooms, and I think that this is the point in the timeline where Mike is manipulated by William. Because as we know from Sister Location, there was a point in the timeline where William was working, maybe not working, but was listening. Did I say William or Mike? I meant Mike. If I said William, I meant Mike. There's a period of time where Mike was working for William, listening to William, doing what William was telling him to do. There was that point in the timeline as confirmed by Sister Location, because that's why Sister Location happens. William sends him down there. I think that this is that point in the timeline. William puts Michael through these horrors to try and make him easier to manipulate into doing things. Because I have a feeling that early timeline Mike, wasn't the best at that. Because you'd assume that he was told to look after his brother in Fights Freddy's 4, but then Michael ends up just bullying him and getting him killed. So I'm assuming early timeline Mike was disobedient, and then William kind of puts him through Fights Freddy's 4 potentially in order to correct that, to traumatize him into being a little bit more obedient, which leads into things like Sister Location. That's my interpretation anyway. There's not a lot of evidence to back that. I just feel like that's the implication, that this is about William about to put Michael through that. So I've mentioned this earlier, but the next thing I want to cover is the Mound. Now I've got two different interpretations for the Mound. One of them is the common interpretation that this is potentially a crying child's grave or Elizabeth's grave or whoever's unmarked grave somewhere there. I think most people believe this, and I would agree it's the most likely interpretation, but I did find an alternative interpretation that I just want to bring up for fun, which is that this could be a soil stockpile, and that this could be a place where a building is going to be constructed. The soil stockpile is just a big mound of dirt that is used for terraforming to allow for a building to be, built on top like normal. And if you actually look on the floor, there's an outline of what appears to be something that could be a building layout. Like it looks like a building could be placed there. So to me, it feels like that could be what's going on there. But my issue with that is then what building's being built here at that point in the timeline. If this is after 1983, after the crying child's death, this is after Freddy's, this is after Fredbear's. It could be for Circus Babies, but I have a reason to believe it's not Circus Babies. I'll cover that soon. I'm just not entirely convinced that if this is a building, I'm not entirely convinced on what building it is, which leads me to go back to the normal assumption of this is probably a grave. But it might be a building. I just wanted to call out that this could be a soil stockpile and this could be getting ready for construction of a building. I just wanted to call out because it was a fun alternative explanation for this that I haven't really heard brought up before. Speaking of the timeline placement, actually, I should cover this. So as we know, William is shunned from this place called Junior's. I don't remember if I brought this up earlier or not, but he is. And a lot of people assume that this means William is drunk and that's why he's speeding, that's why he's abusive. I really don't think so, because William's never really portrayed as a drunk. I took it because it was like, yeah, that's the common interpretation, that makes sense. And there's nothing really going much against it. It just, to me, feels slightly out of character, and I have an even better explanation. I found an alternative explanation that I think fits slightly better. Could go either way. Again, this could just be William being a drunk, and if you think that, that's fine. Again, this is just my interpretation of Midnight Motorist, this whole video. You can feel free to disagree with me on everything, yeah, it's just my interpretation. But I think that he's not shunned from that building because he's drunk. I think he's shunned from juniors because he committed the missing children incident and people don't want the child murderer near their establishment. Because, let's take this as a hypothetical. If he was shunned, like he would be shunned for the missing children incident. We know this because, I mean, it's heavily implied because he uses like these fake aliases specifically to get around that. And I think some of the books clarify that people did know it was William. There wasn't enough evidence to convict William, but people just assumed it was him. And that's why William has to use fake aliases to get into places, and in the novels he even like drastically changes his appearance as well. I feel like it's most in line with that for him to be shunned because this is after 1985. After the missing children incident, and that's why I feel like that works a lot better and a lot cleaner with the already established information. I think that's everything, right? That's every mystery Midnight Motorist. We now have all the identities of the characters. I think Nosted Man's William Afton and Philip Violet's Freddy really heavily implies that. We've got Michael's the runaway, which I feel like is the only one to make sense, considering there has to be a haunted animatronic running him away. Speaking of, that haunted animatronic makes the most sense in my opinion to be Golden Freddy, haunted by the crying child, bringing him to Freddy's. We've also got Mrs. Afton there as the couch person. We explained the Mound, which is probably just the crying child's body, or potentially an upcoming building. And we've also got an explanation for juniors. It could be because he's shunned from the MCI. But there's really one more mystery left, or two more mysteries left, which is, how does 1987 fit into this, if this Five Nights at Freddy's hint even is relevant, and what is the purpose of this minigame? Like, what was the actual reason this minigame was added in? And I feel like the purpose of this minigame, which is the first point I want to cover, is to expand on Mike's backstory. I think that's all it is. I think it's just showing that point I mentioned earlier about Mike transitioning into someone more obedient because he kept running away. He's disobedient now. Mike puts him through FNAF 4, and then he comes out traumatized and easier to manipulate. I think that's all this is doing, is explaining this shift in Mike's character. In a way, it's also explaining an origin of Mike. It's expanding on the origins of Mike. Most of the minigames in Pizzeria Simulator are expansions and new perspectives on things you've already known about, right? Fruity Maze shows missing children incident on screen, and also implies that Follow Me is a parallel to the missing children incident, which is very, very important for the insanity ending. Then you also have Security Puppet minigame, which shows that the puppet minigame has been retconned, and that Charlotte is now the spirit of the puppet, because a puppet in Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was actually haunted by a boy, so that minigame's there to show it was retconned. And I think this minigame is here, like, to expand on Five Nights at Freddy's 4. Like, Five Nights at Freddy's 4 was already backstory of Mike. He murdered his brother accidentally. I guess it was manslaughter if it was accidental, isn't it? And that traumatized him. And that this is expanding on that, showing, okay, and then William punished him for being disobedient, which is something that was already assumed. I think it's just expanding on that general origin of Mike. It's nothing too game-breaking, just like the other two minigames. It's nothing crazy new. And I think that's the important part. It's just a little minor extra thing to Mike's origins. But that also kind of leads into 1987, which I think is honestly quite a huge reveal from Five Nights at Freddy's if it's significant. Because if this is about the origins of Mike, then this minigame showing that Mike is being tormented and potentially now implying that he's being manipulated by William after that. The only way I can see it tying into 1987 is if this is the first thing William does after Mike is become more manipulatable. 1987 is the first thing that happens, I think. Because then that would imply Michael is Fritz. This could be showing that Michael's Fritz, and that's the first thing that happened to Mike after the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 4, which is implied in that minigame. I also want to say that although I keep saying Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is what Mike was put through, I do want to clarify, I still think Five Nights at Freddy's 4 is nightmares later on in the timeline, like after Five Nights at Freddy's 1. I'm just saying, like, the origins of those nightmares would be those observatory 2-room experiment things. I'm sure this video will probably turn out really, really long. I'm sure I'll probably poorly explain myself. But I just want to have, like, a casual discussion on, like, what I thought Midnight Motorist was, my interpretations of it. I'd definitely like to hear alternative interpretations of yours in the comments. Tell me what you think all these things actually are, what I missed. If you agree that this is, by the way, if you agree that the soil stockpile idea is really cool and convincing, what building do you think that could be? Because if this is after the missing children incident and William Afton is shunned, I don't think it could be Circus Babies, because I feel like Circus Babies was before the missing children incident, because I really do feel like Circus Babies is the sister location mentioned in Fights Freddy's 3's phone calls, which are from the original Freddy's location, before the missing children incident, because you have later phone calls that talk about it happening. So if Circus Babies was before the missing children incident, then I don't think the building after the missing children incident could be Circus Babies. But then again, we also know from the Circus Babies teaser that they actually moved the buildings. They were moved from the original Circus Babies Pizza Bowl to a new location. So maybe this is the new location being constructed shortly after 1985, shortly after all that incident happened. Could be. I think it's more likely just a crying child's body, honestly. I would definitely like to hear any sort of expansions of these ideas, or your ideas. Just comment with your thoughts. I've dragged this outro on long enough, I've dragged the video on long enough. Just thought I'd give my 2 cents on this theory because there always comes a time every theorist needs to make a Midnight Motorist video at some point, and I feel like I'm more comfortable with this explanation than I've ever been on any previous explanation that I thought it was time to do my take on it. And I'll see you next time.